Hi everyone, so in this video we're going to be focusing on the nerve impulse. So how does one neuron receive information and send that information to the next neuron? So let's get started. So in this image right here, we basically have two neurons. So this I'm just going to label as neuron 1, and this I'm going to be labeling as neuron number 2. So the first step in the nerve impulse would be step number 1, is that the dendrites need to receive the neurotransmitter from the previous cell. Now, all of these all of these dendrites, you have these extensions of your cell body, and that's where it's picking up the neurotransmitter. So once it picks up the neurotransmitter, it sends that information to the cell body. And the cell body is going to be interpreting the neurotransmitter that it receives, and it's basically going to make a decision to send on a message or to not send on a message, because certain neurotransmitters are inhibitor neurotransmitters in the sense that they are preventing messages from being sent, whereas other neurotransmitters are excitatory neurotransmitters, which are basically neurotransmitters that are causing messages to be sent. So your dendrite is going to be receiving a series of excitatory, so which I'm showing by check marks, and inhibitory neurotransmitters. So what happens is that all of these messages get sent to the cell body, and then the cell body is basically making an interpretation. And it really is interpreting on how many inhibitory neurotransmitters and excitatory neurotransmitters it gets. So ultimately, the cell body decides, do I pass on a message, yes or no? Once that decision has been sent, then the message, which is basically going to be a nerve impulse, which is basically an electrical signal, is going to be generated at the cell body, and it's going to travel along the axon to the axon terminals. Now, it doesn't actually travel along as a train where it goes from point A to point B. What it does, it actually skips along the axon, because as we can see on our axon right here, it looks like we have these rectangular little beads. Now, all of these beads are called the myelin sheath and is made by Schwann cells. And what it does is that the electrical impulse is kind of like skipping in between the nodes along all the way down. It gets to the axon terminal. So once it gets to the axon terminal, it triggers the axon terminal to release a neurotransmitter. So at the axon terminals, we have a release of a neurotransmitter. And the neurotransmitter travels from neuron 1 to the dendrites of neuron 2. And the space in between the neurotransmitters, it's called the synapse. It's a really, really, really small space. The neurotransmitter is released, and then it travels to the next one, and then the neurotransmitter is actually repicked up by the first neuron, so it doesn't stay in the synapse for very long. So it's basically fled the synapse and then removed from the synapse. And then at that point, the entire process starts over again. So neuron number 2, the dendrites pick up the neurotransmitter, sends the information to the cell body. Cell body determines, based on all of the inhibitory and excitatory neurotransmitters it gets, to send or not send a nerve impulse. And if the overall message is yes to send a nerve impulse, produces an electrical signal that travels along the axon to the axon terminal, releases neurotransmitter, and then the story goes on and on and on. So if we're looking at our steps written out, dendrite receives stimuli, cell body interprets the stimuli and sends an impulse. The impulse travels on the axon to the axon terminal. At the axon terminal, it releases the release of a neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter travels through the synapse, and then the process starts again.